Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I am going to show you how to knit the mitered square. This square is super easy, great for beginners. We're just using the knit stitch. So there is no purling in this pattern. If you need a refresher on the knit stitch, I have a knitted bookmark that is a very basic all knit stitch bookmark, and you will learn how to just create a knit stitch back and forth. I will link that tutorial down below in the description box, and once you check that out, you'll be ready to start on these mitered squares. So these mitered squares start with a cast on, a multiple of 2, or any even number. These are great to make blankets. You can make a whole bunch and attach them together. They're great for bags and purses and almost any kind of knitted project. You can see that by decreasing in the center, we get this nice little, almost a raised portion in the center, which creates a visually pleasing pattern when these are all put together. So for this tutorial, you'll just need some 4-weight yarn, although you can use whatever kind of yarn you have. I'm just using an acrylic yarn. I'm also going to be using a 5mm pair of knitting needles, and I have ones that are a circular, but you can use just the double-sided, double-pointed knitting needle, whatever you have on hand. Now when making these for larger projects, always remember what size yarn and what size needle you used, so your squares will always be the same size. You'll also need a yarn needle to weave in your ends, a pair of scissors to cut those ends, and a stitch marker will be very handy in this project. To start, we're going to take our knitting needles. We're going to do the long tail cast on, so make sure you're leaving a good amount depending on how many you're going to cast on. So for me, I'm going to cast on 30. You want a multiple of 2 or any even number. So I'm going to go ahead and cast on my 30 stitches. Once you have your 30 stitches, or however many in an even number that you want for your square. So with my cast on of 30 stitches, that essentially means that I'm going to have 15 stitches on the bottom and 15 stitches on each side. This is a 2-row repeat. So go ahead and turn your work so your stitches are on your left hand needle. For the first row, I'm going to knit all the way across. You can always tell your knit rows if your tail is hanging on this right side. Every time your tail is on this side, you will be knitting all the way across. So I'm going to go ahead and knit the first 15, and I'm going to put a stitch marker in so I know where the middle is as I'm working this square. I have 15 stitches on this right hand needle and 15 on my left hand. I'm going to grab my stitch marker. Now this is completely optional. You don't have to use a stitch marker, but it does help so you don't have to worry about counting quite as much. Place my stitch marker, so now I know that that is the center. 15 on this side, 15 on this side, and I'm going to continue that knit row and just finish those last 15 stitches. So the stitches that I'm working now will essentially be the ones that work the side. So that's going to be the bottom of our square, and then one of these sides will work up, and they just kind of curl in on each other to form that square. So turn your work so your stitches are in your left hand needle, You've still got your stitch marker. We're going to work knitting all the way across until we get to 2 stitches right before the stitch marker. So if you want to count, it would be, for me, I have 15 total. 2 stitches less than that would be up to this stitch, and that's 13. So I'm going to work 13 knit stitches, and then we're going to start the decrease. Now the stitch marker comes in handy because you know that you don't want to work those 2 stitches next to it, and you don't have to worry about counting or losing track of where you are. So now I know, here's my stitch marker, I'm going to decrease these 2 and decrease those 2. So you always want to decrease the 2 that are immediately next to, or the 4, I guess, 2 on one side, 2 on the other of that stitch marker. For this first decrease, we're going to knit 2 together. To do that, you want to knit both of those, so slide both of those 2 stitches onto your right hand needle, yarn over, and then complete that knit stitch. Pull those stitches off, and now you have decreased 1. I'm going to take that stitch marker off, put it back onto my right hand needle. That means that's the center. For this side, when we decrease, we're not going to do the knit 2 together. We're going to slip. So put your needle under that first stitch, slip it off as if you're going to knit. Same thing with the next. So now we have 2 slipped stitches onto our right hand needle. You're going to go under as if you're going to place them back on that left hand needle. Make sure you get both. And now they're both sitting there on my left hand needle. Your right hand needle is behind as if you're going to knit. So you want to grab that, don't lose it, yarn over, and now you can finish that knit stitch. And you've taken off 2 stitches on that side. And that will just square up your mitered square even more. For the remaining 13 stitches on this needle, we're just going to knit across. And that was your first decrease row. We're going to turn, and now, because here's our tail on this side, we know that we need to knit all the way across. So you're going to knit all the way across, take the stitch marker, slip it just as if it were a stitch onto your other needle, so you can always keep track of that center. So you only decrease every other row. And there's my stitch marker. I'm going to slip that off, put it onto my right hand needle, and continue knitting the remaining stitches. You can start to see, you'll get sort of a little bump, and that's the actual corner starting. Let's do one more decrease row together. So again, knit until you get to the 2 stitches right before your stitch marker. And those 2 stitches we will work a decrease. Here's my stitch marker, there's my 2 stitches next to it. I'm going to work into both of them and knit them both. Now I've just got the 1 stitch on that needle. Slip off my stitch marker, slip it back on, and we're going to slip, slip, and then knit those 2. So slip as if you're going to knit, slip the next, pick those stitches back up. Make sure you get under both stitches. Yarn over, and then pull that yarn over up and through and slip those 2 stitches off. So now you've decreased by 1. And knit the remaining stitches on the needle, and that is your second decrease row. So like I said, you're going to repeat those 2 rows every time your tail is on the right side of your work. You will be reminded to knit and not a decrease row. So every other row is a decrease. In between the decrease rows, you just have a knit row all the way across. So once you turn your work, if you see that tail hanging on this right side, you know that it is a knit all the way across row, and you don't have to worry about decreasing. So keep working that until you have 4 stitches remaining, and I will show you how to finish off your super fun and easy knitted mitered square. Alright, so I now have 4 total stitches. I still have my stitch marker in to mark that center. If you ever feel like you've decreased too much or maybe missed a decrease, you can always check there should be the same number of stitches on each side of the stitch marker. Now, while the stitch marker is optional, I do really recommend using it just because it'll make your life easier and it'll make this project go that much faster. You probably also noticed that as you worked back and forth decreasing, it went a lot faster. So you start with the most stitches that you will have on your needle at the very bottom, and as you decrease, you create this little mitered center, and you have less stitches each row. You can see the garter stitch goes that way on one side and that way on the other, and it really is a fantastic little pattern. So I have 4 stitches left. Turning my work, here's my little tail on this right side. That reminds me that I need to knit across. So I'm going to go ahead and knit these 4 stitches. At this point, I'm just going to take off my stitch marker, let it fall, continue to knit those last 2 stitches. You still have 4 stitches left. Turn your work. And now we're going to work these 4 stitches. We're going to work the front end, so they knit 2 together. Make sure you're getting under both of those stitches. Yarn over, pull those off. You've got 1 on that hook, or that needle. And now we're going to slip, slip, and then work off those 2 that you just slipped. And these last ones can be tricky just because they're the last 2 stitches on your needle. And now we have 2 stitches. So at this point we don't need to work another knit across. We're just going to fasten off. So I'm going to leave a fairly long tail, and I recommend leaving a longer tail, especially if you're going to be sewing these together. That way you have some extra. So to finish this off, I'm going to put my yarn needle on the end and sew it up through those stitches. So just weave your end through your yarn needle, pick up your work, turn it so that end is that first needle. You want to put your yarn needle right through both, Just pull that through. You can slide your needle out, and now just pull it tight and snug, and you've finished your mitered square. You can see that one side has sort of a little bit of a ridge, and the other side is a little bit more flat. Now, some people like to consider this the front side or the right side, and this the wrong side. Some people like this as the right side and this as the wrong side. It's really up to you, personal preference, however you want to make your squares and attach them into a bigger project. You can see if you make a bunch of these, you can also change the way that these diagonal miters go and create quite an interesting blanket pattern. So if you make a whole bunch, you can have these go in whatever direction, and it really accents the blanket or the overall project that much more. To weave in your ends, I like to always weave in on the wrong side, so this I prefer to have as my right side, the one that has a little ridge. And so for context, when my little end from the cast on is on my left side, I know that I'm working the front or the right side for me. This was our all knit side, and that for me was the wrong side. So to weave in, I'm just going to go through to my wrong side and find some stitches to weave back and forth this little tail. You don't want to pull too tight, you don't want to distort your square too much. Just a few back and forth, and you can cut your end there. I'm going to do the same thing with this tail, and then I'll have a nice little mitered square. So now I've got 2 mitered squares. I'm going to make a whole bunch of these. They're really fast, they're really easy, great for beginners, and you can turn them into blankets or bags or scarves or really whatever you want. They're being a square, they're very versatile. I hope you enjoyed this knitted mitered square tutorial. Please be sure to give me a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any of my future knitting projects, crocheting tutorials, and other yarn content. Happy knitting, everyone! Until next time, bye!